But otherwise, I think it's up to individual presenters how they handle it. But I guess if you wave your hand around enough, or if they can't be seen on the screen, perhaps even find the appropriate moment to ask a question. So I think what I also need to do is read to you the staff update sheet for the past year, because it's been a very busy year for us at the AONB. And I've just got a list here, so forgive me for reading a list, but it's too long for me to have had to remember. The AONB plan for 2020 to 2024 is published. There is 50,000 copies of the visitor guide printed, and already nearly 15,000 have been distributed. The newsletter Coastal Views is reaching 815 recipients each month. 9 projects have been supported throughout the Sustainable Development Fund, totaling just over £20,000. 5 volunteer projects have been supported through the Environmental Community Projects Fund, totaling nearly £3,000. We have recently invested in a new website for the Northumberland Coastal Path. We have given advice to planners on over 160 planning applications within the AONB. Beadnell Conservation Area has been designated. This designation was first proposed in 1999, I beg your pardon. Still an awful long time ago. We've completed the second dwelling use review for villages within the AONB. This snapshot suggests that approximately half of the housing stock is in use as second homes or holiday lets. It's amazing how many people were interested in this and who didn't have any figures to use. And lots of people are quoting these figures now about holiday lets and second homes. Coast Care volunteering initiative on target to meet Heritage Lottery Fund outputs and developing a plan agreed for the next phase. The Shorebird Habitat Creation Scheme implemented at Old Helsay Farm. Accessing agent product is up and running. The crypt housing, the Bamborough Ossuary, was officially opened by the Bishop of Newcastle in late November last year and is now open to the public daily. A new website called Bamborough Bones is online and contains a digital ossuary. The project recently won the Hidden Gem category at the recent UK Heritage Awards. So at this point, I'll just make 1 or 2 comments and then pass you straight on to Richard Willis. It's a difficult time for everybody with COVID. It's changing rapidly on a daily scale. Latest figures I have today is we certainly haven't beaten it yet. 80 new cases yesterday in Northumberland, and it's spreading throughout the county. So nowhere, I can assure you, is going to be immune. We just have to make sure that we do what we're advised to do and keep safe as much as we can. So with that thought, which is unfortunate, but it's true, we really have to think about it. I'm going to pass you on now to our first speaker. And just to keep the thing rolling, I've suggested that we don't come back to me in between each speaker. The speaker will just introduce the next one and we can all the way through. And the questions will be handled at the end by Ian. So the first speaker, Richard Willis, who will be talking about space for shorebirds and NCC's new Coastal Wildlife Ranger Service. Over to you, Richard.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. I'll attempt now to share my screen. If all goes well, you'll be able to see my presentation as we get it going. So how does that look for everybody? Does that look okay, Jeff?
Well, I haven't got anything changed, I'm afraid. I can't see it. This looks like it's coming up now. Yes, there it is.
You've got the screen there, that's great. So that's smashing, okay. Right, I'm all set now. So yeah, my name's Richard Willis. I'm a Senior Wildlife Ranger for the new Ranger Service from Northumberland County Council, which is called Space for Shorebirds. And it's a service which is dedicated to protecting the birds and the grasslands of the Northumberland coast. So what I'd like to do is just to talk to you a bit about why the service has been set up, a little bit about the birds and about the dune grasslands, and then talk about how people fit into that equation and how we can all help with the issues that we talk about today. So without further ado, we'll go on to our first slide proper. So why is the Space for Shorebirds project being set up? Well, Northumberland County Council for several years have been preparing their local plan, which will secure a certain amount of house building and tourism development within the coastal zone. And of course, that increases the amount of visitors to the coastal zone and the number of people actually walking on our shores and our beaches. So that's got potential to impact the important bird populations that we've got, so shorebirds and also dune grasslands that we've got here. At the same time, we've got developing science which shows increasing disturbance can actually impact bird populations. And in fact, we've got a local bit of science prepared by Newcastle University, which shows where a species called turnstone has access to an undisturbed high tide roost, then it's a lot less likely to experience population declines. So what we can infer from that is when they are being disturbed, when they don't have access to undisturbed high tide roosts, they're actually suffering. And sitting alongside that, we've got a threat from a particular prickly invader, which is threatening our wonderful dune grasslands. So those are the reasons that Northumberland County Council took a strategic approach to put this together to allow the local plan to proceed. So I think now if we talk a little bit about the birds, which is obviously my huge passion. So I think the big thing to say is that really it's the whole of the Northumberland coast which is important for our shorebirds. It's not just certain areas, though the areas of rocky shore and muddy estuary and these areas of stinky mud are the most important areas for the birds. We'll talk a little bit about how that fits in with their feeding methods later on. So what do we mean about shorebirds? Well, there is a taxonomic definition, but I think it's sort of a good way to say it is these are birds that spend a lot of time on our shore. They've got these prominent legs and they've got this adapted bill shape. So lots of different species have got different ways of getting their food. Some have got short sort of stubby beak, which they use like a little bulldozer, like these turnstone here, or some of them have got a really long beak, which they use for probing in the mud, and that's how they find their food. Now, lots of the birds are long distance migrants, so some of them will migrate all the way from West Africa and they'll pass through Northumberland on the way up to sort of Arctic Greenland and Arctic Canada and Svalbard. But some of them spend around about 9 months of the year here, and then they'll go up to the Arctic region and then they'll come back. So there really are they're our birds, and therefore, they're our responsibility. And sitting alongside this, we've got the privilege of hosting nesting seabirds such as terns, which will be obviously one of the speakers will be talking about later, and also breeding ring plover. So now we go on to the actual habitat that they're interested in. Now, it's obviously not that appealing to us, but we tend to go for a nice sort of sandy beach, but this is the sort of habitat that our shorebirds go for. So it's this mixture of rock platform and mud, and there's lots of seaweed and there's loads of nooks and crannies, and that presents areas and opportunities for invertebrates to get in. So you were talking about things like larvae and worms and crabs and snails and all this sort of thing. So all that food in that area presents huge opportunities for our shorebirds, hence the different bill shapes to exploit those different niches. I think one thing to say about the shorebirds is a lot of their time is spent feeding just to get through the winter. So they need to really maximize that time, and their feeding cycle is really dedicated by the tidal cycles. So when the tide's out, the buffet is open and those birds are straight in, and that's their time to feed up as much as they possibly can. When the tide comes in, all they're really interested in is energy conservation. So the big thing is really not trying to trying to avoid disturbing them at that particular time. So we're now going to one of my favourites of our shorebirds, which is the purple sandpiper. I always think, I mean, I think purple is maybe a bit of a stretch, but it looks a bit grey and a bit dumpy in lots of lights, but this is a nice photo of a purple sandpiper, and they do have that little purplish tinge. I always think of them as being like a really tough and yet vulnerable species, because they're so vulnerable, because they're absolutely wedded to this thin area of rocky shore. Lots of our other shorebirds go inland to roost or go inland to feed, say, on permanent pasture. But this species is absolutely wedded to that really thin ribbon of habitat. And because it's so wedded to it, if it gets disturbed from there, well, it's got nowhere else to go. And sadly, this is a species that nationally has experienced a decline of around about 50% in the last 25 years, though the Northumbrian populations are actually holding up fairly well, thankfully, but we've got a big part to play in that. Lots of the population decline also looks as though it's associated with the population shift to the north, which would be associated with the climate emergency, which of course some of the speakers will get onto today. So we've talked a little bit about the birds, and I think we now go on to the areas of dune grasslands and just talk about some of the star species, and then one of our sort of the villain of the piece. So we've got nationally and internationally important dune grasslands, really right from Drury Ridge Bay up until the very north of the county. And they support a real wealth of plants and invertebrates. So we're talking about invertebrates like beetles and flies and bumblebees and moths. So, really botanically rich, but lots of invertebrates dependent on them. And the dune grasslands are under threat to an extent, in that some of them are managed really quite well, and some of them have got a little bit of a lack of management, so they're tending over to scrub. And another threat to the dune grasslands is that there is some erosion as well, both from the sea, but also from trafficking from people. And there is this particularly prickly invader that we'll get onto shortly, which is the villain. But this plant is what we've got a photo of here, is a plant that we really should all know. It's bloody cranesbill, and it's the county flower of Northumberland. It grows in dense drifts from around about Blythe right up to the north of the county. It's a real sort of showstopper. You really notice it. It's a beautiful plant. So the next one, I think this is one of my favourites, is purple milkvetch. Really striking colour. It's this sort of purpley blue in this picture. And what's good about this plant is it indicates where the dunes are in good condition. So where we see this plant, we know that things are going quite well in the dune. And where we don't see this plant, well, maybe we've got a problem that we need to look a bit more closely at. And now we've got the villain of the piece, which is piri-piri burr. Now it's a villain because it's a non-native invasive species, and it came here from New Zealand around about 100 years ago. Why it's a problem is it displaces all those lovely plants that we're mentioning before, and just ends up with a carpet of piri-piri and all these sort of sticky burrs. And those sticky burrs end up getting caught on your shoelaces, on your clothes, and worst of all on your dog, because we've seen dogs absolutely covered in piri-piri burr to the extent where they've actually had to be shaved, so it can be quite painful for the dogs. So what we say with piri-piri is, if you get the piri-piri burr actually stuck on you, if you can prise it off and pop the burr in a bin, or if I'm walking my dog, I pop the burr in a poo bag. And the way to avoid getting the burr on you is really just try and stick to the main paths when you're crossing the dunes, rather than the little side shoots. And that just avoids you coming into contact with the piri-piri as much as possible. So we've talked about the birds then, and we've talked a little bit about the dune grasslands. So now we need to go on to really, which is potentially the most important part of it, which is the people and the part that people play. So I think, as we've seen, and as Jeff mentioned, the COVID crisis isn't going to go away, and we've found out actually how important it is for people to have access to our green space, and no more so than our coast. It's so important for recreation. But with that recreation, there is this potential for disturbance. So every time we set our feet onto the coast, that potential's there. So what do we mean by disturbance? So that's anything which really changes the behavior of the birds. So if the birds would be otherwise feeding, and instead they're flying away or they're walking away and they're not feeding, well, that's disturbance. And if that happens once or twice a day, it's not really an issue for the birds. Where it is an issue is if it happens tens or even hundreds of times a day, that can impact the bird itself, or as the science is showing us, it can actually impact upon the bird populations. As well as that, the potential for disturbance includes the threats of nest failure for repeated disturbance of nesting birds during the spring and the summer, nesting birds such as terns and ring plovers. So that is a really important part to play. So you can't mention people without mentioning dogs, and dogs play a huge part of it. And at Space for Shorebirds, we are dog lovers, and that's my dog on the right-hand side. That's Roxy playing with her friend, Frankie. So I think it's important we don't villainize dogs in this piece, but we need to really acknowledge that the science on this, and it looks very much as though dogs contribute around about 50% of bird disturbance incidents. So it is a really serious issue. So we're calling out to dog owners to join our dog rangers and take that dog ranger promise. And that's really to give the birds space and not to chase the birds. And in return, we'll look to showcase their dogs on social media. But in terms of the general guidance that we would like people to look at is when they're visiting the coast, first of all, just look out for wildlife. We've got this fabulous coastline with so much wildlife there. That conscious effort of just looking out for and being aware of wildlife will change you when you go to the coast. And secondly, give birds space. Around about 40 to 50 meters will ensure that they can just continue with their feeding behavior or their roosting behavior. And next is if you follow the signage and any requests by rangers. So these will be things like if we've highlighted a particular area which is important for, say, feeding birds or roosting birds, we'll pop up some temporary signage, or even more importantly, if there's nesting birds. So we might ask you in those circumstances to pop your dogs on a lead, but we'll only do that when we think it's absolutely necessary. And fourthly is one thing I mentioned before, which is when you're crossing the dunes, if you're able to stick to the main paths to ensure that you're not spreading the peri-peri burr. So finally, really, it's a plea to help. So the Space for Shorebirds project's been running about 2 months now, so we are in very, very early stages, but our rangers are out talking to people and engaging with people. But it is more difficult given the COVID crisis that we're not able to do all of the functions that we would like necessarily to do. So we're really calling out to everybody to get behind Space for Shorebirds and get behind the birds that we've got on the coast, to share the guidance, to join the dog rangers. We're on social media in terms of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and any support that you can give us through there would be hugely appreciated. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening. I've left our contact details there. It would be so nice to hear from any of you, so please do get in contact. If you Google Space for Shorebirds, you'll be able to find us on there. And finally, I'll hand over to Ian Robson for if there's any questions at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for that very informative talk. We have a question from Chris and Mac. I don't know if it's from Chris or Mac, but here we go. Has there been significantly more disturbance of shorebirds this year?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, and I think it's one that we need to hold our hand up and just say we don't know the full answer. But what it looks like is anecdotally is there were periods where maybe the birds weren't being disturbed as much, and then as the lockdown was begun to ease, which was sort of around about the June time, then there was really almost a tidal wave of people visiting the coast, and it got very, very busy. So we went from a very low disturbance point to a very high disturbance. And what it seemed to me when I looked for particularly for breeding shorebirds such as ring plover, is that there had been problems with ring plovers nesting on our coast this year.
Okay, thanks. Unless there's any more questions, if you want to pop a question in the chat, at the moment we've only got that one. So you've obviously done a very good job there, Richard, in answering everyone's questions before we had the chance to ask them. So that's good. Nothing more appears. We'll move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Dr. Hannah Fluck, who is Head of Environmental Strategy at Historic England. Hannah's work on climate change. She's also the author of Historic England's Climate Change Adaptation Report. And she's contributing author to the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. Hannah also chairs the UK Historic Environment Climate Change Adaptation Working Group. So I don't think we've got anyone better placed to talk to us about the impacts of climate change and heritage. So hopefully Hannah's there and she's ready to come on and share her presentation with us.
Hi, yeah, hopefully I can get you to see the screen. Oh, it's all gone dark. That's not a good sign, is it? Can you see my screen yet?
Yeah, that's good, Hannah.
Okay, I've got a thing in the way that's stopping me turning it into a full PowerPoint. There we go. Right, we're off. Really, really nice to follow the shorebirds there. In my spare time and past life, I've been involved in some shorebird research ringing programs, including trying to capture young chicks of Arctic terns and others in Iceland, and I live on the south coast, so we have similar issues with the pressures from dog walkers and nesting shorebirds. So yeah, interesting to hear some of those challenges. So I was going to talk to you about sort of two topics which I think relate quite closely together: the relationship between our cultural heritage, the historic environment, and natural environment, and the way in which those together relate to climate change. It's a sort of combination of two talks that I gave earlier this summer in two slightly different contexts, which I've been refining for slightly different audiences. I'm afraid I was really hoping that I would actually get to see the beautiful northeast coast, but sadly I'm sat in rainy Hampshire instead. I'm not going to make any attempt to talk about your area, but hopefully a lot of the things that I am talking about can relate to some of the challenges and experiences that you have. So firstly, I think everyone knows that climate change is one very huge existential challenge for us and our wildlife and our places. The projections for the UK are for warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers. I think the challenges in particular around sea level rise, changing coastal processes, the changes in precipitation, increased intensity of rainfall, changes in direction of some of our prevailing weather, and increases in our humidity and temperature, and how that may affect things like visitor numbers, footfall, and some of these more secondary effects, which cause problems for not just for our cultural heritage, but for all sorts of aspects, as well as presenting some opportunities. And we're already seeing changes in incidence of wildfire, changes in flora and fauna, the growing season extended, the impacts that has on some of the structures that we're trying to look after, some of the places that we're managing. But it is also important not to just focus on the doom and gloom, because I don't know about the rest of you, but at the moment, if I hear any more bad news, I think I am just going to sit in the corner with a stiff drink and try and forget about things. So one of the messages that I always try and bring to thinking about climate change in the historic environment is that actually we have some things that can help, and we have some ways in which we can talk about these things which enable us to engage people with some positive action. So hopefully you won't leave this feeling like there's not much we can do about things and it's all miserable. So the other thing I wanted to look at, because I think I keep butting up against this in the work that I do on climate change. So I should hold my hand up. I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist. I deal with human evolution. For me, the distinctions between culture and nature are pretty artificial. But I think it's very easy to forget that actually that division is very real in a lot of our policies and a lot of the structures that we have to work within, and yet isn't actually really reflective of the way in which a lot of people view the world, or the way in which the world around us is. Most of the environments that we're looking at are the result of human activity over millennia, shaping our coasts, our rivers, our landscape, and leaving those traces in those landscapes, which continues to influence everything from where our flora and fauna are, the very shape of those places, the ways in which our rivers move through our landscape, even that kind of thing. So unpicking that is quite important to trying to bring together some of these shared interests. The other thing is, I think, as we've just heard with the Shorebird presentation, the relationship between people and our environment is so closely connected that we can't solve a lot of the problems that we're facing in our natural environment without engaging people. And certainly the climate crisis is exactly one of those. It's an anthropogenic problem, and it needs human solutions. So trying to recognize the complexity of that relationship, I think, is a good starting point. And it matters because, as I've just said, that a lot of the places that we think of as natural actually aren't. And even places like the Amazon rainforest, the more that we learn about them, the more that we are learning that they are actually, even some of the most remote corners have been affected by human activity, and the ways in which people have behaved has influenced and still influences the flora and fauna of those places. This graph here comes from a really fascinating project that some of my colleagues at Historic England are involved with, that's looking at biodiversity throughout the Holocene through archaeological records. And one of the things that it's exploring and that it's picking up on is an explosion in biodiversity that coincides with the Neolithic. So the Neolithic is the point in our history in which we started farming, and the point in the history of the British Isles that you get the development of a mosaic landscape as a consequence of human activity managing and creating that through agriculture, and the relationship that has over thousands of years with our biodiversity is a really fascinating one. I've also got an image at the bottom here that I like to use to illustrate how quickly we can forget how extensive human activity is and how extensive our humanly created landscapes are. This is the Somerset Levels under flood in 2014. And this is East Lyng and the Isle of Athelney, which are the green bits sticking up. Now, those are the bits where Alfred the Great was hiding out from the Vikings in the reed beds of Somerset. So actually, you've got the other part of the story. I always use the Lost Kingdom TV series, which I think it features your part of the world quite heavily. But this is the bit where he's hiding out the reed bed from the Vikings on those bits of land. That used to be swamp and now has been turned into farmland. But when it rains an awful lot, it tries to revert back to its swamp like character again. And this is going to be increasingly more challenging, as we know that flood risk is going to increase with climate change pressures. I mentioned that we have an anthropogenic problem and we need human solutions. This is the catchphrase of the Climate Heritage Network, which is an international network that I'm involved with, strongly encourage you to have a look at some of the work that we're doing, but it's particularly around engaging with the UN and the IPCC on bringing traditional knowledge, cultural heritage to bear on some of these challenges that we have, recognizing that actually the ways in which the arts, culture and heritage can engage people, the sorts of knowledge that traditional knowledge that particularly Indigenous peoples around the world have, can be incredibly important. So this is part of a global conversation on this. It also matters for communication. So I've been gradually collecting little snippets, Twitter feeds and things, where people are trying to talk about how we engage the public with the natural environment. And I've noticed a trend that most of the time, the places that people use to convey those messages. So Teresa Villiers at the bottom there, standing in front of, I think it's a in Northumberland, with some lovely dry stone walls in the background there. These are humanly created landscapes and places, and I don't think it's any accident that these are chosen to engage people, because people like like to connect with the human stories of places. And as I said earlier, the connection, that 8,000 years since the Neolithic, of the relationship between people and our landscape and shaping those landscapes is runs very deep. So I think we can use it to our advantage. The other reason it matters is that there's a lot of discussion around wilding at the moment, this idea of going back to nature. And the more that we learn about the history of our places, the more we learn as archaeologists about the way in which our places have changed through time and the relationship between human activity and those changes, the less natural they look. Now that starts to become important if you're thinking about allowing natural processes to take things back. What does that actually mean? What are we taking them back to? It's not really rewilding. It may be working with natural processes, but also a lot of those natural processes have had human intervention, require human activity to make them work better for our wildlife. And that's often processes that have been going on for thousands of years. An example here of the coastal grazing marsh in Essex, a humanly created habitat, which is incredibly important, also threatened by climate change, but something that could be used to support some of the habitat creation and management of our coast through some of the changes that we're facing. The other interesting idea that was put to me by a collaborator, someone I'm collaborating with on some research on how we manage changes in landscapes, someone who works in the natural environment, observed that they thought that natural processes are often seen as destructive for cultural heritage and constructive for the natural environment. And I was thinking about this and thinking, well, it's not necessarily the case. So the bottom left here, we've got Must Farm in Cambridge, so really famous prehistoric settlement that was discovered a few years ago with incredible preservation. You can see every cut mark on those pieces of wood, exactly how they constructed those roundhouses. There, the natural processes are exactly what has protected that heritage. Oh, I've just seen a message saying move the window away from the shared application. I don't know what that means. The other example here is managing wildflower grasslands. Now, a lot of our habitats are those that are remnants of earlier practices in land management, and we often have to work quite hard to retain those and to stop natural processes entirely taking over. And I think it's also important that particularly in communicating with the public, we don't belittle the skills and the effort and the cost of investing in the management of our natural places, and that actually we can't just, it's not just as simple as walking away and letting nature take over if we want to encourage the diversity of flora and fauna that we need and that we value. Now, need to go back, skip that slide too quickly. So I also think that this becomes important when we're thinking about climate change, because the challenges that we're facing need us to really work together to understand how people and places and wildlife and natural processes interact, and the sorts of things that we need to do to be able to survive and engage with and adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And there are quite a few examples now internationally about how we know that traditional land management practices can really help to adapt to some of these challenges. Also, just I think this is a map that a colleague of mine spotted, which shows a nice correlation between areas for carbon sequestration and woodland and the distribution of ancient woodland. Unsurprisingly, they coincide, but it's nice to be reminded. We've also had a number of projects that we commissioned looking at how we can describe the historic environment in the language of natural capital and ecosystem services. This is one from the Blackdown Hills AONB down in the southwest. Now, they were talking about the characteristics of their landscape, particularly some of the hedgerows and linear features, and the roles that those features play, not just in the landscape character of those areas, but also in terms of sequestering carbon, reducing runoff, preserving soil qualities, reducing erosion, etc. And I think, again, it's very easy just to think of the historic environment as that cultural thing that sits on top of all the other natural bits underneath, but actually it can be integral to a lot of those processes. The other thing I think is our water courses, and it's we've had a number of pieces of work looking at what happens when you really start to unpick the history of our water courses, and how a lot of them really aren't terribly natural in their courses, even though they look wiggly and run through green spaces, and we've got thousands of years of trying to manage those in many places. So the other thing, I think one of the benefits that the historic environment, your historic environment colleagues can bring, is taking a long view. We take a really long, I mean, I take a very long view because I deal in millions of years of human history. Might be a bit extreme for some, but certainly thinking about many generations, thousands of years of human activity in the landscape. And it's also very human focus. So we're looking at people, how they have responded and reacted and shaped places through time. And that means that we are also well suited to think about the future. Being able to think about those sorts of intergenerational changes really does equip us for thinking about what the futures might mean in terms of climate change and how we might adapt to that. The other thing is that when you look at human history, the one thing that characterizes it is our incredible ability to adapt to challenges. So that can give us hope that we are going to be able to adapt to the challenges that we have. So looking in particular at buildings, there are an awful lot of myths about our older buildings being difficult. They're not terribly energy efficient. They're quite tricky to deal with. They need to be looked after. They're very fragile. The more research that we do into this, the more we realize that that's not necessarily the case. Actually, a lot of our traditional buildings are incredibly well suited, can recover far better from flooding than if you look after them well, the modern buildings. They can be energy efficient. They are inherently sustainable. The fact that they are surviving for hundreds of years is really a very good thing. We know that reusing and recycling and repairing things is better than getting new things, but we don't tend to think about our built environment in that way, which is a shame, because if we do, we'd realize that as a country with the oldest building stock in the world, that's actually a real benefit and something to be quite proud of. And again, I think that the designation of heritage sometimes seems a barrier to trying to make energy efficiency improvements and things, but actually it's an opportunity for us to really push for better, more sustainable solutions. So we can see that as an opportunity rather than a barrier. Archaeology, that time depth, that knowledge of places through time, the stories of people in places through time, the impacts of human activity, again, I think a strong advantage. And even where you have destruction around the coast, there are also discoveries associated with that sense of something good coming out of what can also can be seen as a pretty challenging situation. This is Haysborough in Norfolk, one of the most rapidly eroding bits of coastline, but also one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of a generation, with footprints from 1 million years ago being discovered as a consequence of that erosion. And there are various groups who've been working with community historical societies and archaeological societies to try and take advantage of that and record that and bring those benefits to bear on that work. And also our historic landscapes, our parks and our gardens, taking that landscape view, thinking about those changes across space as well as time, can be very advantageous. And a lot of the history of our designed landscapes and our parks and gardens are about managing air quality, providing good places for people's well-being. And I think particularly in these COVID times, we've seen how important access to those sorts of places has been. So heritage itself as a subject area and as a discipline is very good at thinking about how we lose things, how we cope with change, that idea of collective memory, and how we adapt and can retain those things that matter, but adapt to the changes that come, which I think is a very helpful approach. I have a PhD student who's looking in particular at managing coastal heritage in the Cornish coast, and recognizing that actually we may not always have the answers. There may be lots of different perspectives on what is important about some of these places, and she's developing an approach which she calls a bit like the choose your own adventure books, like this Cave of Time book here, where you can capture those different views, the different pieces of information, but allow different people to navigate their own way through that information, and allow conversations about what might work best for those places and how to manage sometimes the loss of those heritage assets. Finally, I always like to finish with a Lego reference. My ex-colleague Neil Redfern, who's now at the Council for British Archaeology, gives an excellent lecture about heritage as Lego, which I have unashamedly borrowed here. So I think hopefully a few of you have seen the Lego movie, but in the Lego movie we have the dad, the baddie, who likes to build the Lego kits and stick them all together with a glue. The hero of the Lego movie, Emmett, is aiming to be a master builder, someone who can use the skills that they've learned through building those kits to adapt to the changing needs of the world around them, and definitely not fixing things in place with glue. And Neil suggests that perhaps in the heritage sector we should be a bit more like Emmett and use our skills to adapt to new challenges. But there's also another strand I heard a tale of a parent who was complaining that their child kept wanting Lego kits for Christmas and birthdays, and this was a pain because they needed to stay up all night building these things before birthday or Christmas. And I was horrified. That's not the point of Lego. We don't build it for the kids. I mean, maybe I do a little bit on a Christmas morning because I do like building a Lego kit, but you don't build it before you give it to them. And again, I think sometimes it can be hard for us as experts in the heritage sector to let go, to let others use and learn from the building blocks of cultural heritage to try and adapt to the future. But I think it'd be interesting to see what happens when we perhaps let go a little bit and equip people with the knowledge we have about traditional buildings, about the archaeology of places, but let them work with us and think of creative solutions to adapting to future climate. So I have a challenge to you all to try and find ways to embed climate thinking in some of your heritage decision making, but also if you're working in other aspects of climate change and the natural environment, to think about how you might bring heritage into that. To break down that division between nature and culture. What is the historic environment of some of these places? How can that work to bring people in to help you adapt to some of these future challenges? And how can you make better use of some of those skills from your heritage professionals for future climate action? And probably most importantly, we're all on a steep learning curve with this, and we will be for some time. So sharing those experiences and challenges and research becomes really, really important way of trying to address that. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was an excellent and very thought-provoking presentation. We haven't got any questions on the chat at the moment, so if anybody has got any... Oh, we have, sorry, Georgina Hunt. Do you have any experience or historic generally historic England generally, sorry, of working on historical coastal fisheries?
Oh, I don't directly, and I would probably want to defer to my local colleagues who probably will do. So I can guarantee that someone somewhere in historic England will have. But if there are particular cases in mind, then interested to hear what you're thinking of.
I don't know, Georgina, if you want to unmute and just expand on that.
I was really interested in talk. I was just wondering, because I work on the Northumberland coast looking at coastal heritage and fishing heritage and to look at how fish stocks have changed. And I was just wondering if working in different areas of historic England, whether you'd had any direct contact with working on fisheries in different areas on the south coast, for example.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I think my PhD student did start trying to look at that. So she's looking at the Mullion Gunwallow area of Cornwall, which I know the Mullion's got a history as a fishing harbour. I've also been doing quite a lot of work with Anthony Firth from Fjorda, who I know has done some studies on cultural heritage of coastal communities. I think it's some of the research has been in the northeast. So there may well be some things there, but I will ask the question and let you know if I find anything.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Georgina. Thanks, Hannah. Well, I think my take-home message there was to listen to our historic and built heritage professionals and take the long view. So often we take the very, very short view, and I think taking the long view when you're managing a coastal landscape like the Northumberland coast is so important. I was thinking about this today in planning and how much space we give over to cars in the planning system generally and in our lives. And you know, we should think about how, whilst that's important now, it's not going to be so important in the future, and we should make that reversible, especially with COVID and how important green spaces are to people. And we should think more carefully about those things. So thanks for encouraging us to take the long view, Hannah. I think that's going to be a really important message. So our next speaker is Dr. Chris Redfern. I know Chris very well. I've ringed with Chris for a lot of years. He got his first ringing permit in 1976. So he must have started ringing well before that, so probably before I was born. He's a trustee at the Natural History Society of Northumbria, recently retired from an academic post at Newcastle University, and now spends most of his time ringing, and particularly seabirds and, more importantly, terns. So over to you, Chris. Hopefully Chris is there.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me okay? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you fine, Chris. That's great.
Super. And can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay. Wrong one. Sorry, I'm just trying to search a pointer. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm going to talk about the relationship between Arctic terns and Antarctic ice, and that's something that we're only beginning to appreciate. So, Arctic terns are a feature of the Northumberland coast in the summer, and we have around 4,000 pairs breeding here. 1,500 or so breed on the Farne Islands, and these have been studied by ringing chicks and the adults for many years, particularly in the courtyard area of Inner Farne. The terns are here for around 3 months, and the British Isles host roughly 10% of the world population. The Inner Farne courtyard has room for around about 200 or so pairs of Arctic terns, and the individuals that nest there tend to come back to the same or an adjacent 2 by 2 meter square each year. So they're very site specific in their nesting habits. And that raises the question why they might like to nest here. And the answer to that is that it's a good place to nest with no ground predators. The frequent public visitors to the islands in the summer are probably a good deterrent to aerial predators, and there appears to be good food supplies in the seas along the Northumberland coast. Another good question is, where are they when they're not here? And that's actually quite a difficult question to answer. Although well over 100,000 birds have been ringed in the British Isles over the years, the recovery rate of ringed birds away from the breeding colonies is very low. Arctic terns are certainly seen in the Antarctic waters during our winter, but otherwise we know, or at least knew, very little about the precise wintering areas and their migration routes and strategies. That's now beginning to change with a study using geolocators in Greenland by Carsten Egervang, published in 2010. And he attached electronic devices called geolocators to the legs of 50 Arctic terns nesting in Greenland and managed to recover and download data from 11 of those when the birds returned the following year. And his birds fell into two groups with respect to their outward migration, shown on these pictures in green. So you have a group of birds that went down the East Atlantic on the outward journey, and a group that went down the east and then swapped over to the west for the last part of the outward journey. Apart from that difference in outward migration strategy, all wintered in the Weddell Sea and returned by the same largely West Atlantic route in the spring. So in this context, where do our Northumberland Arctic terns go to? And to answer this question, I started the study in 2015 in collaboration with Richard Bevan, also from Newcastle University. We could only get this study off the ground because David Steele, who was the head ranger on the Farne Islands at the time, put us in contact with BBC, who were looking for projects on the Farne Islands to film. Unfortunately, the BBC and also the manufacturer of the geolocators, Migrate Technology, provided some funding for the devices. And we were able to repeat the study 2 years later in 2017 as a result of the generosity of Natural History Society of Northumbrian members and the Seabird Group, who provided additional geolocators for our work. Now, these geolocators are small electronic devices shown here on the left, attached to plastic colour rings. And we catch the birds on the nest using various sneaky devices and fit one of these devices, let the bird go again, and hope that the bird will come back the following year. These devices are very clever, and they record a number of different environmental parameters, which for our purposes the most important were light levels, and they record maximum light in 5-minute intervals. They also recorded maximum minimum temperature, and also critically time, which is set to GMT on the devices. All those data are stored in the device memory. The battery lasts about 2 years. The downside of these things is we have to recapture the bird to get the device back and to download the data. So we had two groups of birds then, groups fitted with geolocators in 2015 and another group in 2017. For the 2015 group, we had 27 Arctic terns carrying geolocators, and the subsequent year we saw 23 of those and managed to recapture 21 birds. The other 2 birds were caught the following year, and 2 years later I managed to capture another bird. And overall, that's an 89% recovery and 1-year survival rate, which we thought was really very good. 2017, we tagged 25 birds with geolocators, and the following year managed to get 24 back, and that's a recovery and 1-year survival rate of 96%. The data that's collected by the geolocators are really impressive. This plot on the left is a light image plot, and it's just the raw data with light levels during each day as a vertical line, and you can see this dark block here is nighttime, and from the time of the dawn and the dusk thresholds we can work out, all this software can work out day length and the time of midnight, and from those parameters we can work out latitude and longitude, and that is to say where the bird is in the world. But from this light image plot, which gives the daily light levels throughout the year, in fact, on a scale from, this is a 24-hour scale with midnight as 0, we can see that From around about August, there's some departure in some change in the time of midnight, which shifts a little bit later, and that's an indication that birds have gone west. Midnight here actually is near to 0 GMT because we're not far off the Greenwich meridian. As the season progresses, you can see that midnight changes dramatically and becomes earlier and earlier. So by the time we get down here and beginning November, midnight for this bird is at 0800 hours in the morning. And that's a 16-hour shift, and that means that the bird has traveled 240 degrees longitude around the globe. And that puts it well past New Zealand and halfway around the southern Pacific between New Zealand and South America. And this, this pole-to-pole scale of our migration makes analysis fairly straightforward. And to actually get precise data on position, we use software called FlightR. The particular bird that did that journey is shown here. It was called G82 in 2015, and it was a bird that I managed to recapture and retag again in 2017 when it became G70. And that meant that we have 2 migration tracks for this individual. You can see the scale of migration here. So the 2015 journey in purple, it tracked across the Indian Ocean to New Zealand and beyond, and then dropping down to the Ross Sea in Antarctica. In 2017, which is the red line, again, traversed the southern Indian Ocean, rather more southerly route that time, but again, went towards the Ross Sea where it spent the winter. So really dramatic movements. They don't all do that, of course, and this is the other extreme, and this is a bird that actually didn't bother to go around the globe, but just went straight down from the British Isles down to the Weddell Sea, where it spent most of the winter until its logger actually stopped recording. One thing you can see on these light image plots is that daylight becomes continuous. In other words, the nighttime stops. And that indicates that these birds from around about early November, or in this case, beginning of December, is at or near the Antarctic Circle. Now, the lack of nighttime in when birds near the Antarctic Circle is a bit of a problem for geolocation because there are no dawn or dusk thresholds that we can use to calculate latitude or longitude. And for that reason, other studies have ignored locations during 24-hour daylight. However, it is possible to estimate location to some extent. And if you look at the theoretical light intensity for a point at -70 degrees, for example, you can see that even though there's 24-hour daylight, the light reaches a minimum, and that the time of minimum is the time of midnight. So if we fit curves to the data for individual birds, we can actually work out longitude very accurately. And of course, once we've got longitude, the fact that birds in 24-hour daylight locates it at or near the Antarctic Circle or further south. So we can get an awful lot of information from geolocators. I referred to temperature, and the temperature measurements, particularly the minimum temperatures, are actually really very useful. I think this is, the graph here shows the temperature profiles for individual birds from the 2017 group. And as they get to November, temperature, the minimum temperature drops rapidly. So the birds experience sub-zero temperatures from early November right the way through to early April. And that's the time they start to return to the UK and the minimum temperatures start to rise again. This graph, the points are colored to represent different phases. The green here is the phase when software can estimate location because there isn't 24-hour daylight. The red is the period when there's 24-hour daylight. The blue is when, due to seasonal progression, the nighttime returns and it's possible to get accurate geolocations. So the rapid decrease in the minimum temperatures as the birds approach the Antarctic indicates that the birds are associated with sea ice or icebergs until they leave in early April. And that means that these birds are associated with Antarctic ice for a third of their annual cycle. Many of you may be bird watchers and will know that Arctic terns are very similar to common terns, but in a roosting flock you can distinguish the Arctic terns because they have shorter legs than the common terns. And in fact, Arctic terns have relatively shorter legs than any other tern species. So it's highly likely that they have short legs because that's an adaptation to living in an icy environment. This photograph on the right here is not a bird sitting on ice in Antarctica. It's actually a bird sitting on ice near its breeding colony in Iceland. So not only do they experience ice in the non-breeding season, but they're quite happy with ice in the breeding season too. Now, with the geolocation data and available satellite data for sea ice concentrations, we can do some rather nice things. And we can plot the locations of birds onto satellite images of Antarctica for relevant periods. And that can give a nice direct view of the association between Arctic terns and Antarctic sea ice. In this particular slide, there are sea ice concentration data from satellites for 2 periods in November, early November, and later in November in 2 years, 2015 and 2017. And from the sea ice concentration of the geolocation points, we can see that for most birds, there's a considerable amount of sea ice at the geolocations. As time goes by, until we get to later in November, the birds move gradually towards the Antarctic coastline, as shown by this graph, and that's because the sea ice is retreating with the Antarctic summer as the sea ice melts. One particular thing to notice about these two vertical panels here is that the sea ice extent in 2017 is very much less than it was in the same period in 2015, and that's something to bear in mind for a later slide. We can also plot the geolocations of birds or their positions onto satellite images of the Antarctic, and that really gives a nice view of the individual environments of some of these birds. And there are some examples here. So there's a bird here that's quite nicely tracked along the Antarctic coastline during the Antarctic winter. There's another bird here that spends a fair amount of time associated with this patch of sea ice, which is, I think, just off the Shackleton ice shelf, but also spent some time in areas where there's rather less sea ice. And again, with some of these other birds. And this particular bird here on the left, this bird is in the Ross Sea, and this is actually a satellite image from March, and the bird was there in March. And at this time, the Antarctic winter is approaching and the Ross Sea is beginning to ice over again. So these environments are really quite extreme. So when the birds are in 24-hour daylight, they generally move west. And these are the data from the longitude estimates of birds in 24-hour daylight. So that was in 2015, they moved west to varying degrees. For the 2017 group, there was rather a different pattern of movement, and these birds tended to converge along the East Antarctic coastline to regions bordering the Shackleton ice shelf. And the position of the Shackleton ice shelf is this gap here between these two prongs. So a very interesting difference in behavior, which may be related to an unexpected decrease in Antarctic sea ice that occurred late in 2016, and which has been sustained since then. When the day-night conditions return, birds are relatively sedentary until the end of February. And during that sedentary period, it is highly likely they're actually molting. And when some of these birds returned to the Farne Islands in 2018, we took some 2 or 3 feather samples from underneath the wing, and Richard had those analysed chemically, so we could look at their signatures of stable isotopes. And from that information, particularly the stable isotopes of nitrogen and carbon, we can get some information about the diet of those birds in the Antarctic. And the chemical signature of their feathers with respect to those 2 isotopes were clustered down on the lower left of this graph. And that's an indication that the birds were feeding largely on the diet of crustaceans. And there's a marked contrast between that chemical signature and the chemical signature of feathers from Arctic tern chicks on the Farne Islands. And we know that chicks on the Farne Islands are fed with sand eels or other fish, which is a higher trophic level. So the birds in the Antarctic then are probably feeding largely on krill, which is the most abundant crustacean in the Southern Ocean. And there's some rather nice data modeling krill swarms that show that krill swarms are quite abundant around the Shackleton ice shelf. In fact, krill is intimately associated with sea ice, and sea ice is very important for krill populations. And this is a nice demonstration of perhaps why our birds in 2017 had converged either side of the Shackleton ice shelf. So after a stationary period or a fairly sedentary period, the birds then moved west again in preparation for the migration home. So our Northumberland Arctic terns then, they enter the edge then East Antarctic pack ice in early November. They move towards the Antarctic coast with the receding ice as the Antarctic summer develops. And they then move west along the Antarctic coastline. And it's possible that the transition to the day-night conditions again might be a cue for molt initiation. And that's some biology that would be nice to get a better grip on. So that molt, the initiation of molt is probably a cue for the birds to stay relatively stationary, followed by further westerly movement and then return migration via the South Atlantic back to the Farne Islands. The key messages from this then really stem from the fact that Arctic terns in the Antarctic are not central place foragers, which they are in the breeding colonies, because they don't breed in the Antarctic, so they can forage wherever the food is. They don't have any constraints in foraging locations. And that makes them an ideal species for long-range monitoring of the biological consequences of changes in Antarctic ice. And the high return rates for farms birds and the accessibility of our Northumberland colonies makes long-term projects for remote Antarctic monitoring possible at a relatively low cost. Finally, there are a number of people and organizations that have been vital for this project. I'd just like to highlight a few: BBC Springwatch and Migrate Technology for the geolocator funding, and the superbly generous Natural History Society of Northumbrian members for funding geolocators in 2017. And of course, the National Trust for allowing the project to go ahead on the farms, and the National Trust Rangers for helping to monitor the nests of geotagged and other terns. So that's it. I'm quite happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a fascinating talk as well. There's no questions on the chat at the moment. I've got a very non-scientific and quite a simple question. One of those maps that you showed a really long migration right down the center of the Atlantic, without the bird kind of making landfall at all. As we know, terns can't sit on the sea like gulls can. So presumably these birds are finding something to roost on, buoys or ships or something like that. on their journey? I don't know if your data is precise enough to pick that up.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think for my money, I think it's the traverse across the southern Indian Ocean that is most remarkable. I mean, that's an 8,000-kilometer trek, and there's virtually nothing in the southern Indian Ocean. There are 1 or 2 islands. There's Amsterdam Island, for example, and we do know that some of the birds are not far away from that, so that's a possibility. I don't know. They presumably spend time perhaps sitting on maybe plastic debris, I don't know. One of the other, the loggers also record some other parameters, and they record immersion events. So we can actually look to see whether they are sitting on the sea or not. And generally, no, as you say, they don't seem to sit on the sea at all. So they're either flying continuously or they're sitting on floating debris. On the way. So I think, yeah, they're really remarkable birds.
Incredible. I guess before we put ships and buoys and plastic debris in the sea, they must have made use of driftwood or something similar.
Absolutely.
But yeah, definitely adapt. There's no other questions on the chat, Chris, so thanks very much for that. If anybody has anything before, I presume we'll be hanging around till the end. If anybody has anything to ask Chris, then please put it on the chat and we'll pick that up at the end.
I think there was a brief question came up from Georgina.
Oh, sorry, yes, there is. Georgina Hunt again. Have terns been affected by fluctuations in sand eel populations around the farms? Do you have any long-term data on this?
Yeah, we do have long-term data, not consistent data on sand eel populations. It's really quite hard to get measurements of sand eel availability. But we do know that there have been some years where sand eels weren't available, and that does result in high mortality of chicks and low productivity. So yeah, but I think for the moment, the sand eel populations in Northumberland seem to be pretty good. So we don't really understand why that is.
Yeah, so I'm looking at fish diet and particularly around the Farne Islands, and we're finding huge amounts of sand eels in the diet of really big flatfish. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
This year and last year, but I was wondering if you've got any, maybe long-term data. Yeah.
No, but it's really an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good to talk to you about that. Actually.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
And just one more thing, Chris. Any plans to continue these studies?
Yes, I think it would be really good. I think I'm still rather conscious of the fact that although they're really quite light, they only weigh less than a gram. They're still quite bulky devices. I'm always conscious of the fact that they may have an effect, although they don't seem to affect the breeding at all. So I think it would be really good to do a long-term study, perhaps 5 years or more, to see if we can actually really see whether there are consistent changes in the Antarctic and whether we can feasibly use these as a monitoring tool, armchair monitoring of the Antarctic environment, if you like, getting the birds to do the work for us. So yes, but it does require funding. I think we need commitment to long-term funding to get such a project off the ground.
Need some more wealthy members of the Natural History Society.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Chris. We'll move on to our final speaker, Dr. Mike Jeffries, who's a professor of ecology at the University of Northumbria. Mike started studying zoology at the University of Bristol in 1980, and then was very fortunate to spend some time with John Lawton, where he got his doctorate at John Lawton's lab at York, before moving on to the University of Edinburgh. And then after 5 years there, came to join the Northumbria University. Mike says, like so many academics, he's had many other diversions as a shop assistant, civil servant, and a Punch and Judy man. Fascinating. Mike, are you ready to share your screen? And
I'm going to give it a go. Right, I certainly am.
No sign of Punch and Judy.
Oh, sadly, no, which is a great shame. You see, you can't go wrong with Punch and Judy shows. Meantime, given the lives we have to lead these days, I'm at least entry-level incompetent with 5 different versions of online sharing. So hopefully, can people see this? You should be able to see a screen saying time traveling at Beagnell. Yes, I'm getting a thumbs up from Ian. That's smashing. Thank you very much. It's a treat to be here and talking to you tonight because, as you'll immediately tell from my accent, I'm not from round here. But this bit of coastline, really broadly from East Lothian down to Tyneside, has kind of been my local patch for most of my life. And I'm missing it deeply, because at this time of year, I should be taking groups of first year environmental science students up along the coast. We go every year. It's their start of term. They're just barely getting to know each other. Many of them are fairly local, but a lot are not. And to take them out into the wilds of Northumberland is a joy. We have a walk up into the Cheviot Hills to admire the Iron Age forts. And that comes as a bit of a surprise to them, that people used to live up there, because conspicuously they don't anymore in large numbers. And we also have a beautiful walk along the coastline, more or less starting at Beadnell and down to Low Newton. And it's really two themes I want to develop this evening about the AONB, and two possibilities. The AONB is a fantastic arena to get people to think about how environments change in the context of climate change, certainly, and also a habitat which appears to be missing from your management plans, which is shocking. But meantime, back to the first year students. This is last year's lot, and they're doing a bit of time travelling at Beadnell Bay. We walk them along the coast, and when you hit Long Nanny, where the little stream flows onto the beach, we get the students to line up and walk down onto the mud and do a little bit of time travelling. Now, for first year students, they're quite impressed that we're doing time travelling in the first week, but all you need is a finger. And the students are scraping away at the gooey, muddy sand on the surface, down a couple of centimetres, and you'll find this black, greyish layer. And the students have to hoik a lump out on their fingers and give it a good sniff, which they do. And as you can see from Ollie at the left-hand side of the picture there, it's not necessarily a very pleasant experience. It's not that the mud smells muddy. The students say it smells like rotten eggs or stink bombs, because it does. And the mud is very conspicuously blackish grey because of the sulphur-rich compounds in it. That's what gives it the unpleasant and fetid smell. And it gives the students a little peep into maybe the sorts of communities and ecosystems that had the planet to themselves 2,000 million years ago, before there was oxygen freely available in the atmosphere. Now, I'm not sure that those particular microbes in that mud are exactly the same sorts, but those creatures down there in the black mud don't like our oxygen-rich atmosphere. They've been banished into those waterlogged and oxygen-depleted depths where they have to hide away. And it gives the students a very good feel for the fact that this planet changes dramatically. I mean, get them to think about all the things that we've lost. Most species that have lived on planet Earth have gone extinct for perfectly natural reasons, which for students which are starting a degree, which features a lot of ecology and conservation and worries about things like climate change, can be a bit of a shock. But it's another good thing to maybe do with them in the first couple of weeks. And the AONB coast, one of the reasons I love it is because it gives me a strong sense of time and how things change. And ever since I was a kid, I've always loved these kind of reconstructions, and I don't really mind how accurate they are or not, but reconstructions like the picture on the left-hand side there of maybe the Northumberland coast in the Stone Age times, or maybe that's Doggerland being crept up on by the encroaching filling in of the North Sea, or the dunes there at the right-hand side, which are Hawksley, not quite the AONB, but it really ought to be, where you can see the grey boulder clay at the foot, and then that sort of metre-wide wodge of peat and very obvious branches and sticks in it. You can pick them out. They're alder, they're birch, they're willow. They're very much the sort of wet woodland plants we have around us today, and then the sand on top. And it's almost as if time has sort of squeezed and compressed our history. In the same way as you sort of compress a gas, it turns into liquid. The same with this, you compress our history, you get the boulder clay, you get the peat, and you get the sand, and a sense of how this coast has changed, how things can change really quite rapidly. Some of the dune systems are, I'm told, very sudden in their appearance, perhaps individual periods of poor weather. So it always takes me back to this period when the North Sea wasn't completely filled in, when, as the cliche has it, you could walk from Britain across to the continent, where there were sweeping plains and Dogger Island. And I always get this sense on the Northumberland coast more than anywhere else, especially when the sea fret is coming in. And I can close my eyes, I can think, almost hear the mammoths out there on Doggerland. I get a strong sense of how things change, how quickly they can change, and how things come and go, which I think begs some questions about climate change. And it's a good way, again, with the students of thinking about this. What is the problem? Why is change due to climate shifting so difficult, so problematic, so worrying as it is? And I think the AONB has some fantastic opportunities. The nature of the AONB, where it happens to be, the fact that there are clearly ancient settlements there, not just at Hawksley, but further north. The fact you can see that things have changed. There's something about the AONB where we are, which is particularly powerful and certainly calls to me about sea level change, of civilizations being changed, of fauna and flora being changed, and why climate change is so particularly worrying. There's other changes, and another reason I love the Northumberland coast. I like the way that there's particular places where geologists lust after the sort of footprints of ancient creatures that crawled out of the coal swamps a little bit more recently than those microbes in the mud. And that man there in the top right-hand corner, Jean Bart, the notorious French sea captain, scourge of British shipping in the late 17th century, he came ashore at Druridge Bay and burnt down Widrington, or bits of it. I mean, pirates are glamorous enough. Can you imagine how fabulous French pirates must have looked? So I love the fact that there's these tales to be told. The bottom left there, more recent history. I work a lot on ponds, and this pond has always flummoxed me a little bit because it's very long and thin at Druridge Bay. But a few years ago, I suddenly got hold of the reports about the recent World War II archaeology, and it looks very like an anti-tank ditch, which is now a perfectly nice pond, a pond which is one of the most northern sites in the UK for a particular aquatic snail. So benefiting a little bit from our recent history. And things that changed very suddenly and very recently. There in the bottom right is the sea fret coming in to shroud the 8 Men of Lynmouth, the old chimneys, which are no longer there. So I think that our coastline, all coasts chop and change a lot, but the Northumberland coast, with its sense of deep time and more recent change and human intervention, Jean Bart, the Second World War, the industries that have come and gone, I think the AONB is a very fine place to get people to think about time and change and how things do alter. So when you've got a site like this and you can show people the tree trunks and the branches, and if you're very lucky and the tide has briefly stripped away the sand to reveal the peat beds with the human footprints on, that sense that sea levels have changed in the past, that things have shifted, and what is so difficult and dangerous about climate change now. So our AONB is an ideal place to get people to think. I'm also struck, inevitably by the beautiful habitats, and we've heard about some of them. I mean, I do love Bloody Cranesbill as a place. It stops me in my tracks. You're quite right when you see just dune drifts, and I love going out to the Farne Islands every summer. I'm not the best identifying birds, but I will happily stand there and just be shocked by the things wanting to peck me. It's a remarkable experience. I say this as someone who has to be dragged kicking and screaming off dry land into a boat. I looked through the AONB's list of important habitats. Seabird colonies, well, certainly the seabird colonies. The sand dunes, very characteristic of so many parts of the Northumberland coast, immensely beautiful. Pockets of salt marsh. I love salt marsh. Was something about the aerial view of salt marsh, where you get the little salt pans and the gnarly and creepy little creeks that run through it. Very beautiful and strange landscape. Muddy estuaries and shores, the wind grassland. Again, there's something about you go up in springtime and you get that waft of pepper off the wind on the rocky promontories, the coastal slopes, the coastal heath. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, nowhere Nowhere does it mention ponds. Now, I've spent most of my professional life working on ponds. I know what people say, because I always get this. You can see that you go to at conferences and you say you work on ponds, you can see it in people's eyes. They're thinking, well, it's not exactly the Large Hadron Collider, is it? You see, ponds are the most widespread habitats on the land masses of planet Earth. You can find ponds in tropics, in rainforest, in desert, on tiny oceanic islands. There are ponds on top of Arctic glaciers. There's ponds underneath the ice in the Antarctic. I've even got a couple of papers about ponds on Mars. And because they're so ubiquitous and they're so familiar, we kind of take them for granted. There might be a few of you here who've been to the Antarctic or tropical rainforests. I've been to neither of those places, but most of us haven't. I bet all of us have seen ponds. All of us have fallen over in a pond. Here's some Northumberland ponds from the coastal plain. Pond there in the top left in a farmer's field. The cattle still come down to drink it, though it's fairly choked up now. Classic southeast Northumberland subsidence pond, slap bang in the middle of a farmer's field where the old coal seams are collapsing. A pond dug for pond dipping to take kids out to, and the very long, thin anti-tank ditch pond along the length of Druridge Bay. We kind of take ponds for granted. But the AONB has some absolutely astonishing, beautiful ponds. Pond there in the top left, that's on the snook of Holy Island. Now, I don't know how old those ponds are, and given the way the dunes shift, they may not be that old, but I kind of like to kid myself that there were ponds there and that maybe Aidan and Cuthbert saw those ponds. Same kind of habitat. And ponds individually come and go, but pondscapes linger. Or the sheer raw beauty of that pond in the right, with the bluey green bulrush stems that look like some sort of piece of modernist sculpture. And then the very vivid day-glow green of the plants nearer us, which are a celery-leaved water buttercup. Just it stops you in your track how lovely they are. And I don't know if you can make it out. Perhaps if you peep hard at the close-up in the left-hand bottom picture, there are tiny pink specks in the water. Millions of little water fleas, tiny crustaceans bobbing about. These sites, which are often quite small, they're temporary, they're quite ephemeral, hugely rich in life. And those of us who got them down to the AONB a lot, just driving on the coast road, there's little slacks and pools like this in the fields at the side. We take them for granted. But I think we've got some really beautiful and very special and lovely ponds along the narrow strip of the AONB. Things to be treasured, even though they're so familiar and they're so everyday. Climate change sounds like it ought to be a threat to ponds. It rather depends where your ponds are. But here's a nice example from Northumberland of why the shifting climate does become a threat. I mean, the obvious direct threats may be that ponds dry up. It's not as straightforward as that. Lots of ponds dry up. It's not necessarily much of a problem. So there's lots of pond animals and plants that quite like it if they dry up every so often. So here's the same pond, photographed in July 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, and it's the same view if you're not quite sure. There's a sort of low, roundish tree in the distance, slightly to the right of centre. You can see it in all the pictures. There in the very wet 2012, the pond's got a lot of water in it, which has basically killed the farmer's oilseed rape. In 2013, it's bare and dried, not a big deal necessarily. It's still a pond, just hasn't got any water in it. 14, 15 and 16 though, it's full of barley and wheat. One of the problems facing ponds isn't simply that they dry up. It's when they do dry up, some of these ponds, these shallow, ephemeral ponds, whether it's in the fields of southeast Northumberland or on the dunescapes, it allows other vegetation to encroach. In this case, it allows the farmer's crops to survive. Now, this particular farmer was quite tolerant of the subsidence ponds, didn't particularly mind. But that's a potential threat. It's not simply lack of water. It's the lack of water, the changing in temperature is going to change land use. And it's very easy to forget about ponds. It's why we've lost ponds. They've been neglected. We haven't got a use for them. We forget about them. So climate change is this subtle threat to our ponds and smaller wetlands as well, because it allows other changes to happen. And ponds can also be a great help. I mean, here's just some examples of the sorts of things you could do with ponds. You can study fundamental ecological ideas. So the ponds up the top left there, it's at Low Newton. You can talk about the fundamental ecology of how pond animals come and go. Where are particular species? Why are they there? Why are they there some years? or the more practical issues around pond gains and losses. Broadly, certainly in the southeast of Northumberland, on the coastal plain, pond numbers, old maps have stayed broadly stable, though that begs the question what the maps really show you, but broadly stable, but they're not the same ponds. They're not the old agricultural field ponds, they may be golf course ponds. Ponds can be dead good as a help to mitigate against climate change. Ponds in the landscape broadly hold back water. They stop it rushing into rivers and surging along to bottlenecks in towns and cities where it floods. So ponds can be good. And ponds can also just be good for tracking the impact of climate. Over many years, I've monitored the invertebrate animals in some little ponds down at Druridge Bay. That's me in the field. Right? I'm told by one of the old wardens I was regularly mistaken for a sheep, which is a bit harsh. But I was there often on my hands and knees investigating the little creatures. But ponds could do some more besides. See, ponds, like a lot of habitats, give out and take in greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane. And it's ponds in Northumberland primarily, especially ones nearer the coast, they've done a fair bit of work on. Now, the person in this picture is Pete Gilbert, and he's done a lot of work trying to get a sense of how quickly gases are coming and going out of ponds, sometimes using some very sophisticated kits on the left there, little floating chambers you put on the pond with tubes in and out of a gas analyzer that can tell you the changes in the gas just minutes to minutes in front of you, how much carbon dioxide is coming and going. Not entirely sure what he's doing on the right-hand side. I don't think he's going to see any carbon dioxide, but you never know. And if you want a ballpark figure to convince you why ponds are good, not only did we measure the gases, we tried to get a sense of how much carbon there is in the sediments of ponds by taking cores in Northumberland, in Norfolk, in Devon, in Yorkshire. And if ever anyone asks you, keep this in mind as a kind of ballpark figure. A block of mud from the bottom of a pond, it doesn't really actually surprisingly matter which kind of pond, oddly. We thought it would, but it doesn't. A block of mud, metre square, 20 centimetres deep, holds about 9 kilograms of organic carbon, 9 bags of sugars worth of organic carbon. That's quite a lot. Now, when people talk about things we can do to mitigate climate change, we hear a lot about tree planting. I'm fond of trees. I have some trees nearby where I live. I talk to them regularly. But if it's only trees quite slow. They take a lot. You can't stick trees everywhere. You can stick ponds all over the place. Ponds aren't going to solve all our gas emissions, but they could be really helpful, and they're great biodiversity hotspots too. So if we want the British countryside to stay much as it is in its charming and much pictured way and not end up like this, ponds could really be a real bonus. The ponds along the AONB could be. So for me, the AONB coast has two particular threads that have informed a lot of my thinking about it. I love the idea of go time traveling on the Northumberland coast to all sorts of times and places, and it gives you a way to think about change and think about why climate change is particularly threatening. And you can also look forward. Those little teeny ponds there in the right-hand picture were dug out in the dune slacks at Low Newton. There's nothing complicated or fancy. Just do that by hand with spades. And you've got a beautiful little biodiversity hotspot. And we could do a lot more of that, I suspect, along the Northumberland coast, really quite easily. So for me, I want the AONB to be that magical and strange place. I want to be slightly unnerved by tales of the Laidley worm. I want to look at the beauty of the ponds in the dune slacks. I want to maybe imagine that St Aidan and St Cuthbert pond dipped in that dune snook pond. I love the idea that glamorous French pirates could be just lurking over the horizon, and all that history for the AONB. So it's been a treat to come here and talk this evening, and I hope it's given you a flavour about climate change and time and change, and also some encouragement to create ponds. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was fantastic. It's given me a job to do. I'm going to go tomorrow and amend our website and make sure there's some information about coastal ponds on. I'm going to go and visit one when I get back from my holiday and take some photographs of it as well. But it's reminded us that, you know, when we talk about climate, carbon capture, particularly trees and peat aren't the only game in town, and ponds are so important, and definitely it's something that we're very keen on doing, is creating more freshwater habitat across the AONB. I think it's so important, not just for carbon capture and climate change, but for all the ecosystem services that you mentioned without mentioning the word ecosystem services, which, well done. I hate that term. We've got no questions, I don't think, on the chat. Oh yes, we have. Somebody says, hello Mike. That was like a trip down memory lane, as I was a student of yours 18 years ago, and it was lovely to hear you again. Oh, you're on mute, Mike. Mike, you're on mute.
You see what I mean about my serial incompetence? I start every online lecture muted. I was looking at this face, and I was thinking, I know that face. I know that face. When, of course, a trip down, I would like to think my lectures have been updated slightly over the year, but you never know, frankly. So it's good to see you too.
Hi, Mike.
Hello there.
Sorry, we got the Holy Island trips banned.
Oh, they say the Holy Island trips, yes.
Yeah, I don't think any groups went back after our year.
That wasn't the fault of the students, that the hotels changed hands. We were very good for the island economy before those trips. They didn't want students saying, oh dear, there's people, their ears are pricked up now. They'll be thinking, banned? How did you get banned? Oh, we haven't got.
It wasn't your fault, it was totally ours.
So it's just turning into a rather exclusive chat. Another time, if you want to hear about the naked Dutch sea captain on the roof of the hotel, the AONB will have to invite us back for another talk.
Mike, I do need to catch up with you about that at some stage.
Cool.
Vicky asks, how long does a pond have to be in existence to capture 9.8?
That's a very, very smart question, because we've tried to monitor some ponds where we know the exact age. They were dug in 1994, November of 1994. We've been able to dig out the sediments and see how long it takes to capture. For the first 2 or 3 years, they actually don't capture much. It does take a while to get going. But those ponds, when we dug them up, were about 20 years old, and they were some of the ponds that contributed to that figure. After about 20 years, they've got at that amount in their sediments. So say they were certainly accelerating after 10, 20 years, you'll have that amount, ballpark figure.
So we need to get on now and dig some ponds.
You do.
Great.
Oh, good Lord.
Another one on your trip. John Sharp was on your trip as well. So unless there's any other questions, thanks very much for that, Mike. Brilliant talk, very much appreciated. I'll hand over to David Feiger, the AONB officer, who'll sum up today's speakers and make some closing remarks. David.
Thank you very much, Ian. Well, I'm sure you would all like to join me in thanking all of our speakers for some really, really interesting and challenging presentations. So a global pandemic has prevented us from meeting in person today. And its consequences have inevitably been at the forefront of all of our minds over recent months. But I think the talks today have reminded us that we mustn't be distracted from the even greater and longer term challenges that we face, least of all climate change. I was very pleased that Hannah challenged the distinction between nature and culture. It's something as a staff unit we're often asked what we really mean by landscape and conserving the landscape, and you can't start to answer that question without really realizing that the distinction between nature and culture is so artificial, and that they really do blend into each other. And just as Hannah encouraged us to take the long view, Chris, I think, encouraged us to take the big view and to remember how connected the Northumberland coast is to the rest of the world. And next spring, when you see Arctic terns returning, do take a moment to think about where that small bird has been since you last saw it. An extraordinary journey to an extraordinary place, and it does it year after year. It's absolutely humbling, I always think, the migration of Arctic terns. But it does remind us of how connected we are to the rest of the world. And thank you, Mike, for reminding us that a walk along the coast is always a walk through time, and for challenging us concerning our slight neglect of ponds, and that's a challenge we shall certainly accept and remedy. Fantastic to know that digging a pond can lead to carbon sequestration as well as creating a brilliant new habitat. I mean, I absolutely love ponds because really as soon as you dig them, wildlife starts coming in straight away. But great to know they also have that additional incredibly important function in sequestrating carbon. And I was very pleased that we could start today with Richard's talk about space for shorebirds. I think it was annual forum 3 years ago, probably, that I first talked about this project when really it was little more than the germ of an idea. And it's fantastic to see it now up and running and in such capable hands. So a huge thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to Catherine for organising everything. And it's all worked, which is really good. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. And hopefully this time next year, we'll be meeting in person for next year's annual forum. So thank you all very much.